A German family is huddled in their cellar at 9 p.m., listening to a radio that could get them executed. The volume is turned so low they can barely hear it. Their 8-year-old daughter is stationed at the window watching for neighbors. If anyone reports them to the Gestapo, they'll all be dead by morning. This is 1943, Berlin, and the voice coming through that radio isn't German. It's British, broadcasting from London, telling them the truth their own government has been hiding for years. The Germans are losing the war. But in Nazi Germany, listening to foreign radio isn't just illegal. It's treason, punishable by death. No trial, no appeal, just a knock on the door and a trip to the execution yard. This family knows the risk. Every night, they take it anyway, because they're starving, not for food, for truth. This is the story of the secret radio war inside Nazi Germany. How ordinary people risked everything just to hear what their government didn't want to know. And how one radio broadcast became more dangerous to the Third Reich than any bomb. The family in that cellar is the Schultz family. Father Hans, Mother Greta, daughter Anna, son Friedrich. They're not resistance fighters, not spies, not heroes. They're a normal middle-class family in Berlin. Hans works in a factory. Greta manages the household. It started in 1940, 3 years ago. Hans's brother was a soldier, sent to France during the invasion. The official report said German forces were unstoppable. Victory after victory. Minimal casualties. Then Hans got a letter. His brother was dead. Killed in action near Dunkirk. The official report said he died heroically, advancing on enemy positions. Part of Germany's glorious campaign. But Hans knew something was wrong, because the dates didn't match. The letter was dated 3 weeks before the official victory announcement, before Germany supposedly crushed the British forces at Dunkirk. Hans started asking questions, quietly, carefully. He found other families, other letters, other deaths that didn't match the propaganda. And he realized something terrifying. The government was lying, not just exaggerating, not just spinning, completely fabricating entire battles, erasing casualties, rewriting defeats as victories. Hans needed to know the truth. That's when he heard about the foreign broadcasts. The BBC, broadcasting from London in German, every night, telling Germans what their own government wouldn't. But listening to enemy radio was illegal. The Volksempfänger, the people's receiver, the cheap radio the Nazis gave every household, was specifically designed to only receive German stations. Hans would need a different radio, a better one that could pick up long-range broadcasts. And he'd need to hide it. Possession of a foreign-capable radio was enough to get arrested. Listening to foreign broadcasts was a death sentence. But Hans was already past the point of caring about rules. His brother was dead, and the government was lying about it. He found a radio on the black market, paid twice what it was worth, brought it home in pieces, hidden in a toolbox. He hid it in the cellar behind a false wall, soundproofed to space with old blankets. When he told Greta what he was planning, she went silent, not angry, not scared, just silent. Then she said, "When do we start?" That first night was terrifying. Hans assembled the radio in the cellar. Greta brought the children down, made them promise never to speak about this outside the house. Anna was 6. Friedrich was 10. Old enough to understand that some secrets could kill you. Hans tuned to the BBC frequency. Static crackled, then a voice. "This is the BBC Home Service, broadcasting to Germany." The voice was German. Native speaker. Clear, calm, professional. Everything German radio wasn't. German radio was propaganda. Constant martial music. Victory announcements. Speeches about German superiority. The BBC was different. It told the news. Real news. Casualty numbers. Military setbacks. Defeats the German government never mentioned. That first night, Hans learned the truth about Dunkirk. It wasn't a glorious German victory. It was a disaster. The British evacuated 338,000 troops, escaped complete annihilation, and the German forces failed to stop them. Hans's brother died in a failed offensive. Not a victory, a failure. The German government lied about everything. From that night on, the Schultz family listened every night at 9 p.m. But they weren't alone. All across Germany, families were doing the same thing, huddled in cellars. Volume turned low. Children watching for informants. Millions of Germans listening to forbidden broadcasts. The Nazis knew. They couldn't stop it. Radio detection vans patrolled neighborhoods. Gestapo informants watched windows. They offered rewards for reports. It didn't stop the listening, because by 1943, everyone knew someone who died in the war. And the official story wasn't adding up. Stalingrad, winter 1942-43. The German Sixth Army. Surrounded. Destroyed. 90,000 soldiers captured. German radio called it a strategic withdrawal, a heroic sacrifice. The BBC called it what it was, a catastrophic defeat, over 300,000 casualties. The worst German military defeat of the war. Hans listened to both broadcasts. The difference was staggering. German radio. Our forces have completed a tactical repositioning in the east. The Führer's strategic vision continues to guide our inevitable victory. The BBC. The German Sixth Army has been annihilated at Stalingrad. Field Marshal Paulus surrendered despite Hitler's orders. The Eastern Front has collapsed. Hans turned to Greta. Every night, the Schultz family gathered in the cellar. The air was cold, damp, and thick with the smell of earth and fear. Hans would tune the illegal radio, his hands steady despite the tremor in his heart. The crackle of static would give way to a voice, crisp and clear, speaking English from London. The BBC. It was their only connection to a world outside the suffocating grip of Nazi Germany. One night, the announcer reported a staggering number of German tanks destroyed on the Eastern Front. Hans looked at his wife, Greta. Her face was a mask of disbelief. The official newsreels showed only glorious victories, endless columns of German soldiers marching triumphantly. "How many more are they lying about?" she whispered. Hans didn't answer. He didn't need to. Every night, the Schultz family listened. And every night, the truth grew darker. The war was going badly. The Allies were winning. Germany was losing. But on the streets of Berlin, a different reality was being manufactured. Propaganda posters screamed a final triumph. Speeches from party officials promised wonder weapons that would turn the tide. The disconnect was maddening. Hans watched his neighbors, people he'd known for years. He saw them parrot the slogans, repeat the lies, and cling to impossible promises. Were they fools? Or were they just too terrified to face the truth? Then, in March of 1943, something changed. A new neighbor moved in across the street, Herr Müller. He was middle-aged, quiet, and kept to himself. Hans didn't think much of it until his daughter, Anna, noticed something. She was at the window during one of the BBC broadcasts, her small form a silhouette against the blackout curtains. She saw a faint light in Müller's window, flickering, then disappearing into darkness. This happened every night, at the exact same time as their secret broadcast. Hans felt a jolt of recognition. The flickering light wasn't random. Müller was listening too, down in his own cellar with his own illegal radio. A wave of relief washed over Hans. He wanted to make contact, to find some solidarity in this suffocating isolation. To know for certain that he wasn't alone. But Greta stopped him, her hand gripping his arm. "It could be a trap," she warned. "The Gestapo plants fake listeners to catch others." She was right. The Nazis were devious. They sent agents into neighborhoods, pretending to be fellow resistors. waiting for someone to let their guard down or reveal themselves. Trusting the wrong person meant a knock on the door in the dead of night, a one-way trip to a concentration camp or worse. So Hans waited. He watched, he listened, and across the street, Mueller did the same. Two families separated by just 10 meters of cobblestone, both committing treason, both utterly alone. That's how the Nazi system worked. It weaponized fear, suspicion, and division. It ensured that even people breaking the same law couldn't trust each other. Then one night in April, everything changed. The BBC broadcast a special bulletin. "This is a message to all our listeners in Germany," the announcer said, his voice imbued with a quiet power. "We know you're there. We know you're listening. And we want you to know you are not alone." Hans sat frozen, his breath caught in his throat. The broadcaster continued. "Millions of Germans are listening to these broadcasts. In every city, every town, every village. The Nazi government wants you to believe you are isolated, that you are the only one with questions, that everyone else believes the lies." Hans looked at Greta. Tears were streaming down her face, silent and glistening in the dim cellar light. "But you're not alone," the voice from London insisted. "There are millions like you, Germans who want the truth, Germans who refuse to accept propaganda, Germans who remember what their country used to be before the Nazis destroyed it." The broadcast continued for 10 minutes, a direct address to the hidden listeners of Germany. It was a message of acknowledgement, encouragement, and solidarity. When it ended, Hans switched off the radio and sat in a profound silence. For 3 long years, he felt like a traitor, betraying his country by listening to enemy broadcasts. But that single message had reframed everything. He wasn't betraying Germany. The Nazis were. By seeking the truth, he was trying to save what was left of it. The next night, as Hans looked out the window, he saw it. A single candle, lit in Muller's window. It burned for exactly 10 seconds, then vanished. Hans understood. He lit his own candle and held it up to the glass for 10 seconds before extinguishing it. A signal, a silent acknowledgement. We are both here. We are both listening. Hans never spoke to Mueller, never made direct contact. But every night after the BBC broadcast, 2 candles would appear in the darkness. 2 families, connected by a thread of truth, yet still isolated by an ocean of fear. That was the reality of resistance in Nazi Germany. You couldn't trust, you couldn't organize, you couldn't communicate, but you could light a candle and know that somewhere, someone else was doing the same. By the summer of 1943, the war came home to Berlin in a terrifying new way. Allied bombers hit the city almost nightly. The wail of air raid sirens became the soundtrack to their lives. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble, and thousands died. German radio blamed the Allies, calling them barbarians and terrorists. The BBC, however, explained the strategy. "These raids target German military infrastructure," the announcer said. "Factories, rail yards, supply lines. The Nazi government deliberately places these targets near civilian areas to use you as human shields." Hans listened to both versions. German radio. British terrorists murder innocent civilians. The BBC. Strikes hit munitions factories. Civilian casualties are unavoidable due to Nazi strategic placement. One narrative made Germans victims. The other made them pawns. Hans didn't know which to believe completely. But he knew one thing. German radio never mentioned the civilian casualties when their own bombers hit London, or Warsaw, or Rotterdam. The hypocrisy was staggering. One afternoon in August, Hans came home from work to find Greta pale and shaking. "Anna," she stammered. Anna told someone at school. Hans's blood ran cold. "What did she say?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "She was arguing with another girl about the war. She said things she shouldn't know. Things that aren't in our newspapers." Hans closed his eyes. "Children. They don't understand operational security. They don't understand that in this Germany, knowledge itself could be a death sentence. If her teachers noticed, if they reported it, if the Gestapo investigated, who heard her? He asked. Her teacher. Several classmates. That night, for the first time in years, the radio stayed off. A week of agonizing silence followed. Every knock on the door, every unfamiliar car on the street sent a jolt of pure panic through Hans. But nothing happened. 2 weeks passed. Maybe the teacher hadn't noticed. Maybe the classmates forgot. Or maybe, just maybe, they were all listening too. By late 1943, the BBC broadcasts changed their tone again. They offered less news and more direct encouragement. Germany will lose this war, the announcer stated plainly. The only question is how much longer you will let the Nazis drag it out. How many more of your sons will die for a lost cause? Hans listened and wondered why his country kept fighting a war it couldn't win. But he knew the answer. Surrender meant admitting defeat. It meant the Nazi leaders would finally face justice. Hitler would burn Germany to the ground before he allowed that to happen. And every German secretly listening to the BBC knew it. In December, Hans's factory was hit in a bombing raid. 12 people died. 30 were injured. Hans survived. The next day, German radio reported it as a terrorist attack on civilians. That night, the BBC reported it as a successful strike on a munitions factory. Hans had worked in that factory. He knew they made artillery shells. The BBC was right, but so was German radio. The workers were civilians. That night, Hans sat in the cellar, the radio silent, just thinking. Who was right? Who was wrong? The Allies were bombing factories, but workers died. The Nazis put those factories in cities, using workers as shields. Who was the criminal? There was no good answer. Just layers of tragedy and horror that no one could escape. Then, in February 1944, Muller's candle stopped appearing. Hans watched the window across the street every night. Nothing. 3 days later, Gestapo trucks pulled up. Muller's house was raided. Furniture was thrown into the street. The family was arrested. Hans watched from behind his curtains as they dragged Mueller out in handcuffs. He saw his wife, his children, all taken away. The candle in his own window remained unlit. The silent connection was broken. The fear was all that remained. Thank you for watching. If this story resonated with you, please consider subscribing for more content like this. Stay safe and stay curious. Imagine it's 1942. The world is at war, and you're living in the heart of Nazi Germany. Every newspaper, every radio broadcast, every public announcement tells you the same story. Germany is winning. The Fuhrer is infallible, and victory is inevitable. This was the reality for millions, a world built on a foundation of meticulously crafted lies. But what if you started to question that reality? What if you dared to seek the truth? This is the story of two ordinary people, Hans and Greta, who risked everything for a simple act of listening. Hans and Greta were not soldiers or spies. They were a young couple living in a small apartment in Berlin. Hans worked as a mechanic, Greta as a seamstress. Their days were filled with the mundane routines of rationing, air raid drills, and the constant, suffocating presence of Nazi propaganda. The state-controlled radio, the Volksempfänger or People's Receiver, was designed to tune in only to German stations. It was a closed loop of information, a powerful tool to shape the minds of an entire nation. But Hans was resourceful. He had a passion for electronics, a skill he usually reserved for fixing broken appliances. One evening, hunched over his workbench, he tinkered with their radio. He carefully modified its coils, extending its reach beyond the government's grasp. It was a dangerous game. The act of listening to foreign broadcasts, what the regime called Feindsender or enemy stations, was a crime punishable by imprisonment or even death. It was considered Rundfunkverbrechen, radio crime. The Gestapo had ears everywhere, and neighbors were encouraged to report any suspicious activity. A faint crackling voice from an illicit frequency could be a death sentence. That night, after triple-checking that the blackout curtains were securely drawn, Hans and Greta huddled together in their small living room. The air was thick with tension. With a trembling hand, Hans turned the dial. The familiar bombastic tones of German state radio gave way to a storm of static. He nudged the knob millimeter by millimeter. Then, through the noise, a new sound emerged. It was a voice, speaking German, but with a different accent, a different cadence. It was the BBC, broadcasting from London. For the first time in years, they heard a different story. They heard reports of Allied victories that were never mentioned back home. They heard about the true scale of the fighting on the Eastern Front, the staggering losses that the German High Command concealed with tales of strategic withdrawals. They heard speeches from Churchill and Roosevelt, voices of defiance that promised a world free from tyranny. It was like a window had been thrown open in a sealed room, letting in a gust of forbidden air. This nightly ritual became their secret act of rebellion. While the city outside slept under the watchful eye of the Reich, Hans and Greta's apartment became an island of truth and an ocean of deceit. The information was a heavy burden. They heard about the atrocities being committed, the concentration camps, the systematic persecution that the state media either ignored or grotesquely distorted. They learned that the glorious war was not so glorious after all. It was a brutal, devastating conflict fueled by an ideology of hate. Living a double life was incredibly stressful. During the day, they had to wear masks of conformity. They had to nod along to the confident pronouncements of their colleagues and neighbors, feigning belief in a victory they knew was a lie. A single slip of the tongue, an unguarded comment revealing knowledge they shouldn't have, could lead to disaster. The fear was a constant companion, a knot in the pit of their stomachs. Every creak of the floorboards, every unexpected knock at the door, sent a jolt of adrenaline through them. One evening, their worst fear was nearly realized. As they were listening, a loud, insistent banging rattled their apartment door. It was the block ward, the local block warden, making his nightly rounds. Panic seized them. Hans lunged for the radio, yanking the plug and shoving it under a pile of blankets just as Greta opened the door, her heart hammering against her ribs. The warden, a stern, officious man, peered into their apartment, his eyes scanning for any sign of transgression. After a few tense questions about their blackout curtains, he finally moved on. They leaned against the closed door, gasping for breath, the silence in the room more deafening than the static had been. Despite the close calls, they couldn't stop. The truth had become as essential as food or water. It wasn't just about knowing the facts. It was about holding on to their own humanity. The propaganda was designed to numb them, to make them compliant cogs in the war machine. Listening to those broadcasts was their way of saying, "We are still here. We are still thinking for ourselves. We will not be deceived." They began to share what they learned, but only with a tiny, trusted circle. A quiet word with Greta's brother, a coded phrase to Hans's most reliable friend from the workshop. It was a delicate, dangerous dance of spreading whispers of truth. They were planting seeds of doubt, tiny cracks in the monolithic wall of lies. This was their resistance, not with bombs or bullets, but with information. They were part of a silent network of thousands of Germans who, like them, chose to listen, risking their lives to stay connected to the real world. As the months turned into years, the news from the BBC became more and more significant. They followed the D-Day landings in Normandy, tracing the Allied advance across France on a hidden map. While official German newsreels showed staged scenes of unwavering morale, Hans and Greta knew the truth. The Reich was crumbling. The constant Allied bombing raids over Berlin, which propaganda framed as minor annoyances, were reported by the BBC as part of a massive, strategic air campaign. The difference between the lies they were told and the reality they were hearing became a gaping chasm. Finally, in the spring of 1945, The moment they had been waiting for arrived. Through the crackle of their modified radio, they heard the news of Hitler's death, followed shortly by the announcement of Germany's unconditional surrender. The war in Europe was over. A strange quiet fell over Berlin, broken only by the distant rumble of Soviet tanks. There were no victory parades, no triumphant speeches on the state radio, just a stunned, deafening silence. For Hans and Greta, it was a moment of profound, bittersweet relief. They had survived. Their quiet rebellion had been vindicated. They had held on to the truth when the entire world around them seemed to have gone mad. They emerged from the rubble of their city not as victors, but as survivors who had kept their integrity intact. The story of Hans and Greta is a powerful reminder that the fight for truth is one of the most courageous battles one can wage. In an age of misinformation and digital propaganda, their story is more relevant than ever. They show us that even small, seemingly insignificant acts of seeking the truth can be profound acts of resistance. They prove that you don't need to be a soldier to fight tyranny. Sometimes, all you need to do is listen. Their legacy is not written in history books, but it lives on in the very idea that truth matters, and that it is always worth fighting for. Thank you for watching. If this story resonated with you, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more stories about the unsung heroes of history. Stay curious and never stop seeking the truth.